Wyoming Territory, spring of 1872. The wind carried dust and silence across the open plains near the foothills of the Bighorns, where the land still held the memory of winter, and a woman named Elira Ames had not spoken in over a year. The first time Paxton Caldwell saw her, she was standing barefoot in the dirt behind the burned-out shell of her homestead. Her dress was torn at the hem, her face streaked with soot, and her hands clutched the shoulders of two frightened children, a boy and a girl, no older than 7. A neighbor had ridden into town that morning, saying a fire had taken the Ames place in the night. Sheriff went out to look. Paxton came with when they reached the land. Only the stone chimney still stood. Everything else was ash. Paxton dismounted slowly. His boots crunched over charred wood as he stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the woman. She did not move, did not cry, just stared at him like her soul had been emptied and buried beneath the dirt. "Elira Ames," Sheriff Lane asked gently, removing his hat. She gave a slow nod. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. We came as soon as we heard. Is anybody else?" She shook her head once, quick, final. Paxton's chest tightened. He had known her husband barely. Jacob Ames was a quiet man, kept to his own but fair, the kind of man who built everything with his own hands. Now he was gone, and she was standing in the wreckage with 2 children and no words left. The boy stepped forward, pressing his face into Elira's side. His small voice broke the silence. "Our house burned down." The little girl, her twin by the look of her, clutched a ragged doll. "Mama doesn't talk no more." Paxton crouched slowly, looking between them. "What are your names?" "James," the boy said. "Josie," the girl whispered. Paxton looked up at Elira. Her lips were pressed tight, her eyes distant, but she had not let go of the children once. "We can take you into town," Sheriff said. "Get you somewhere safe." Elira gave a slow nod. Silent, that was how it began. Paxton lived alone west of town on a stretch of land his father had claimed 15 years back. He had rebuilt the cabin himself after the war, kept horses, ran cattle, and let the land speak more than he did. Sheriff Lane asked if he would take them in just for a while. The town had no room for 3, and the children were too young to be split up. He agreed without a word. That night, Elira sat on the small porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders while James and Josie slept curled together on a cot inside. Paxton brought her a cup of warm broth, placing it beside her without asking anything. She did not thank him, did not look at him, but she stayed. Days stretched long on the range. Paxton did not ask questions. He fixed the barn roof, mended the fences, and gave the children small chores. They followed him like shadows, James trailing after the horses, Josie helping pick wild sweetgrass. Elira moved slow, like every step took effort, but she kept the children close and watched everything. She had not spoken a word. That first week, she scrubbed the floors clean with shaking hands. The next, she started folding blankets. Then cooking simple meals, though she still never ate much herself. Paxton watched her quietly. He never forced conversation. He just made space, clearing a chair for her at the table, handing her a coat when the wind picked up, walking beside her when she drifted out toward the creek at dusk. One afternoon, while James and Josie played with stones near the corral, Paxton handed Elira a tin cup of water and said, "You do not owe me anything. You know that, right?" Her fingers tightened around the cup. Her eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away fast. He nodded once. "I am just glad you are here." She looked at him, then really looked, and something cracked behind her silence. Not a word, just the smallest breath, like maybe she had almost spoken. 2 weeks passed. Josie clung to Elira's skirts less. James started laughing again. They played in the dirt and chased the hens and asked Paxton 1,000 questions a day. Why do horses sleep standing up? What is that bird called? Can we rope the fence posts? Elira still said nothing. But every night she sat beside Paxton on the porch while the sky turned gold. And every night he handed her a cup of tea and their shoulders brushed and she stayed. One night, thunder rolled in the distance. Josie woke crying from a nightmare. Paxton rose to check on her, but Elira was already there, holding her daughter to her chest. And for the first time he heard a sound soft, low, barely above a whisper, a lullaby. Her voice was broken, raw like it had not been used in too long. But it was there. Paxton stood in the doorway, heart pounding. The next morning she met his eyes across the table and whispered, "Thank you." His throat tightened. He nodded once, not trusting his voice. She had spoken. Spring deepened. The land greened. Calves were born. Elira began walking the fence line with him, sometimes humming under her breath. She still did not say much, but her silence had changed. It was not empty anymore. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange, she stood beside him at the edge of the pasture. The wind caught her hair, and she looked at him with something steady in her eyes. "I did not think I would feel safe again," she said. He swallowed hard. "You are safe now." She nodded, then asked, "Why have you been so kind to me?" Paxton looked out at the land, then back at her. "Because I know what it is to lose everything. And because you are worth saving." Her eyes filled. She stepped closer. "I am not broken," she said. "I never thought you were." And she just leaned into him. Her head rested against his chest, and his arms wrapped around her like they had always belonged there. She did not cry. She just breathed. He held her as the sky went dark and the stars came out. Not saying a word, just letting her stand there, safe in the quiet. And for the first time since the fire, Elira smiled. By late May, the high grass along the creek swayed with buttercups and the wind softened. The children had begun sleeping through the night again. Paxton noticed it because he no longer woke to soft footsteps or muffled cries in the dark. The house felt steadier, somehow not just filled, but held together by 4 people moving through their days with quiet rhythm. Elira had taken to rising before dawn. Paxton heard her sometimes, moving softly across the floorboards, feeding the stove, pouring water into the tin basin. She didn't sing, not yet, but she no longer hid her voice when she spoke to the children or answered him in the kitchen. Her words came slowly, like water finding its way through dry earth. One morning she stepped into the barn while he was brushing down the mare. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow and her hands were stained with flour. "I saw a man riding the ridge last night," she said without preamble. Paxton turned, the brush still in his hand. "Didn't hear a rider. I only saw the shape. He didn't come down." He studied her face. "You think it was someone looking for trouble?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know, but I don't like not knowing." He nodded once. "I'll ride the fence line after breakfast. If he shows again, I'll see him." She looked at him then, steady. "I'd like to come. You planning to ride? It's a long stretch." "I used to ride farther." He didn't argue. Instead, after oats and bacon were cleared and Josie and James were left in the care of a neighbor woman down the valley, he saddled 2 horses and watched as Elira swung up into the saddle with practiced ease. She didn't look back. They rode west, following the rise of the land toward the bluff. The air smelled of pine and warmed rock. A hawk circled overhead once, then vanished behind the ridge. Elira rode in silence for a while, her gaze sweeping the distance. Paxton kept beside her, his body loose in the saddle, the reins slack in his hand. "He was taller than Jacob," she said after a long while. "Moved different too. I knew every way Jacob walked, even in the dark." Paxton didn't answer. He waited. "I still see him sometimes, in the corner of my eye, in the way James holds a spoon. In the sound of boots on the porch." She cleared her throat. "I keep thinking if I could just hold on to those pieces, he wouldn't be gone all the way." Paxton leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the saddle horn. "You don't have to let go of him to find your way forward." "I know. But I think I was afraid if I moved too far, I'd lose what little I had left." They rode on, the rhythm of the horses filling the space between them. A jackrabbit darted through a patch of sagebrush, and both horses flicked their ears but didn't spook. Later, as they turned back toward the cabin with the sun at their backs, she asked, "Why didn't you go back east after the war?" Paxton adjusted his grip on the reins. "Nothing worth going back to. My folks were gone by then. And the land here, it asks more from you, but it gives you something back. A sort of quiet you can live with." She was quiet, then said, "You came back different, didn't you?" "Most men did." He glanced at her. "You too?" She met his eyes. "Yes." Back at the cabin, the children ran to meet them, cheeks flushed from sun and play. Josie held up a handful of wild strawberries, her palms stained red. "Miss Lorna let us pick them," she said proudly. James tugged at Paxton's vest. "Can we ride the little bay pony tomorrow?" Paxton tousled his hair. "We'll see." That evening, after supper, Elira lingered near the hearth. The fire had burned low, glowing in the grate. She watched the flames, not speaking, her body still. Paxton wiped his hands on a cloth and leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "You ever think about leaving here?" she asked quietly. "I did once. After my father died. Thought maybe I'd go somewhere green, but I stayed." "Why?" He looked at her for a long time. "Because there's things a man doesn't walk away from, not when they're worth staying for." She turned slightly, her face in profile, lit soft by firelight. "I think I'm starting to believe that." The wind picked up outside, brushing against the cabin walls. Elira stepped closer, her hands clasped in front of her. "I'm afraid still," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not the same kind," he nodded, his voice low. "Fear changes its shape. That's how you know you're healing." She looked up at him, something unguarded in her expression. "You keep saying things that hold me up when I don't know how to stand." "I'll keep doing it," he said simply. "As long as you need." Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. She reached out and her fingers closed gently around his wrist, not uncertain, not tentative, just sure. "I don't know what this is between us," she said, voice catching. "But I don't want to lose it." "You won't," he said, and there was steel behind it. "Not unless you walk away." "I'm not walking anywhere." He stepped forward, still holding her gaze, and cupped her cheek with work-rough fingers. She leaned into his touch, her breath slow and even. And when he kissed her, it wasn't sudden. It was a promise wrapped in warmth, shaped by weeks of quiet care and the steady rebuilding of something broken. She kissed him back, soft and certain. Outside, the wind died down. The fire cracked once in the hearth. And inside, something new had taken root. Not loud, not rushed, but real. By early June, the wild roses along the creek bloomed pale and fragrant, and the valley stretched green beneath the long daylight. Elira had taken to walking the slope behind the cabin after supper, her skirts brushing the tall grass, her face lifted to the wind. Sometimes James and Josie trailed after her, collecting smooth stones or chasing each other through the reeds. Sometimes she walked alone. Paxton watched from the porch most evenings, letting her have the distance she sometimes needed. When she returned, her cheeks carried a flush that hadn't been there in the colder months, and her eyes held a shade of quiet that no longer felt like grief. One evening, she lingered at the edge of the pasture after the children had gone in. Paxton was finishing the last of the tack repairs, his fingers stained with oil and leather dye. She leaned her forearms on the fence rail, studying the herd that grazed slow in the fading light. "You ever think about what it would be like to start again?" she asked. He looped the reins over a post and straightened. "You mean somewhere else?" "I mean a life that isn't just surviving the last one." He stepped beside her, resting his elbows next to hers. "I've thought about it more lately." She reached down and plucked a stem of yarrow, twisting it slow between her fingers. "I used to believe my life had one shape, one road. When it burned, I didn't see anything past the smoke. You see past it now. I think I'm learning how to," she said. "But it's strange, learning to want again." Paxton didn't rush her. He watched the horses instead, the way their shadows stretched long across the grass. "I want to build something with my own hands," she said after a moment. "Not just keep what's left standing." He turned toward her. "You've got the grit for it, I've seen that." She gave a small laugh. "I wasn't always strong." "Don't think strength has to be loud," he said. "Sometimes it's just staying when you could run." She looked at him, not blinking. "And what about you?" "What do you want?" He shifted slightly, folding his arms. "I want to know what it feels like to come home to someone who sees me, not just the work I do or the land I keep, but all of me." The wind stirred between them, lifting her hair across her cheek. She tucked it behind her ear and held his gaze. "I see you, Paxton," he swallowed, throat dry. "Then that makes two of us." She reached out and touched his hand, fingers curling around the edge of his palm. It wasn't a grasp, it was steadier than that. Later that week, Elira asked him to show her how to mark the calves. She stood beside him in the corral, sleeves rolled and hair braided tight against her neck. Her movements were deliberate, her expression focused. When the last calf was done, she leaned against the rail, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist. "I never did this kind of work before," she said. "Jacob took care of the animals. I kept the inside." Paxton poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. "You don't have to prove anything." "I'm not doing it to prove something," she said, taking a sip. "I'm doing it because I want to know how, because if this is going to be a life, I want to be part of the whole of it." He nodded slowly. That's fair. She passed the cup back. I don't want to belong to someone again. I want to belong with someone. He looked at her then, long and full. You already do. That night, after the children were asleep and the fire burned low in the hearth, Elira stood in the doorway of the bedroom with her arms crossed over her chest. She watched Paxton set a log on the embers, the soft orange glow lighting the lines of his face. I keep thinking about what kind of woman I am now, she said. I don't know if I'd recognize the version of me from a year ago. He stood slowly, brushing his hands on his trousers. Most of us wouldn't recognize who we used to be. She stepped forward. I think I've stopped trying to get back to who I was. That's not where you're headed anymore. She reached out, resting her fingers over his heart. I want a life that's honest. One that's built slow and steady and doesn't fall apart when the wind shifts. You'll have that, he said, covering her hand with his. With me, you'll have that. She leaned in, resting her head against his chest, and he held her there, the rhythm of their breathing finding the same pace. Outside, the cattle moved quiet in the dark. The wind brushed through cottonwood leaves. And inside, without any ceremony, they began to build something that would hold. By late June, the heat settled in layers across the land, thick with the hum of insects and the scent of dry sage. Elira had begun helping with the accounts ledgers Paxton had always kept in his own careful script. She asked for them one evening, fingers stained with blackberry juice from the pie she and Josie had made that afternoon. He slid the books across the table without hesitation. She studied them by lamplight, brows drawn, murmuring numbers under her breath. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. You've been undercharging for the colts. Paxton sat back in his chair. Didn't think it right to press folks too hard. You're running a ranch, not a charity. She turned the page. You could hold back one gelding each season, train him up proper, and double the income come autumn. He reached for his coffee, watching her over the rim. That your way of saying you want to stay past the summer? She didn't blink. That my way of saying I already have? He nodded once. Then we'll keep a gelding. You pick him. The next morning, she chose a rangy chestnut with a crooked blaze and a habit of tossing his head at the gate. Paxton raised a brow but said nothing. She worked the horse slow and steady, her hands sure on the reins, her posture easy in the saddle. By the third week, the colt stood still when she approached and turned his head when she passed, as though he'd decided she belonged. One evening, after she returned from the pasture, her skirt dusted to the knee and a sliver of hay caught in her braid, she found Paxton oiling the hinges on the cellar door. You ever think about adding a room? She asked. He glanced up. You mean onto the house? I mean for the children. They're getting longer by the day. Josie kicks blankets off and James talks in his sleep about fishing holes. I built this place for one, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Didn't see much past the next season when I started. She crouched beside him, her knees creaking softly. Well, now there's 4. Might be time to see past the season. He looked at her, his gaze steady. If I build it, I'm building it for good. Her voice was quiet. That's what I mean. That Sunday, they rode into town together, a rare thing. The children had been invited to a nearby homestead for a day of berry picking and games, and Paxton needed lumber. Elira came for fabric and oil for the lamps. She wore a dress she hadn't touched since the fire, a pale green one with tiny white buttons at the collar. It hung looser than it once had, but it moved with her like it remembered the shape of her before. At the mercantile, she stepped toward a bolt of calico and ran her fingers over it. I was thinking curtains, she said. Paxton squinted at the pattern. Too bright, not for the kitchen. It could use something cheerful. He leaned in close, his voice low. You've already made it cheerful. She turned her head just enough for their eyes to meet. I want it to feel like ours. Later, on the ride home, she asked, You ever think about what kind of father you'd be? He kept his eyes ahead. I've thought about what kind of man I'd want to be if someone was watching. They're always watching, Paxton. He nodded. Then I want to teach them steadiness. Not just how to hold a fence post or break a trail, but how to stay when it matters. She reached across the saddle line and touched his wrist lightly. Then you already are. That night, as they sat on the front step with mugs of warm cider, James leaned against Paxton's side without saying a word. Josie curled into Elira's lap, half asleep. The stars came out slow and wide, and the air smelled of dust and wood smoke. Paxton shifted just enough so his arm rested across the boy's back. "He's heavier than he looks." Elira smiled, her voice edged with sleep. "She talks to the moon sometimes, says it listens better than people." He glanced toward the sky. "Maybe it does." She looked at him then, her expression soft and open. "I never thought I'd feel like this again." He didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stayed like that until the air turned cool and the children were too heavy to carry in both at once. They each took one, and when they laid them down and pulled the quilts high, they didn't speak. They stood in the doorway a long while, watching the slow rise and fall of breath, the small twitches of dreaming limbs. Outside, the land stretched quiet and wide, and inside, the home they hadn't meant to build was already standing. By July, the afternoon heat settled into the bones of the land, and the scent of sun-warmed wood drifted through the cabin windows. The new room was nearly framed in, its timbers squared and set with Paxton's steady hands and Elira's quiet precision. She measured and sawed alongside him, sleeves rolled, hair bound tight at the nape of her neck. They worked without rush, their rhythm practiced now, one handing the hammer, the other setting the nail. Paxton paused one morning with the square in his hand, watching her kneel to mark a beam. "I was thinking," he said, "maybe we ought to make the back wall wide enough for a second bed, gives them room to grow." Elira straightened, brushing sawdust from her skirt. "They'll need it." "Josie kicked James clear off the cot last night," he chuckled, but she was watching him with a different kind of thought in her eyes. "And what about us?" He held her gaze. "I already built this house for 4. "You thinking I should add another room?" She stepped in, her fingers brushing the buttons of his collar. "I was thinking we don't need to sleep in separate corners of the same home anymore." He set the square down slow. "You sure?" She nodded. "I am." They didn't speak again for a while. He kissed her with the sun warming their backs and the scent of pine thick in the air, and she kissed him like she'd meant to for months fully, without flinch or fear. That night, when the children curled together in their cot, Elira slipped into his room and closed the door behind her, not in secrecy, but in peace. The next morning, the world went on as it always had, Paxton feeding the stock, Elira stoking the stove, Josie chasing after the hens with a bit of biscuit in her pocket. But something had settled deeper between them now, like a well dug farther into the earth. Not louder, not brighter, just certain. Later in July, a letter arrived from Jacob's sister in Kansas. Elira read it by the window, lips pressed tight as her eyes moved over the page. When she finished, she folded it once and set it on the table. "Marion offered to take the children," she said. Paxton didn't speak at once. He set down the harness he'd been oiling, wiping his hands on a cloth. "What did you write back?" "I haven't yet." She lowered herself to the bench beside the table. She said she could give them a more proper life, a house in town, a school with books. Even a piano. He poured water from the pitcher and handed her a cup. "What do you want?" Elira's fingers tightened around the tin. "I want them to run through this grass and dig their hands in this dirt. I want them to grow up knowing how to mend a fence and find north by the stars. I want them to know love that holds steady, not just comfort." He sat beside her. "Then write her that," she nodded. "I will." The letter went out with the next rider, and Elira never looked back. Josie helped her pack it with lavender and a pressed wildflower. James added a sketch of their pony, drawn in charcoal with a shaky hand and proud strokes. August came with golden light and the buzz of dry grasshoppers. The children's room was finished, the walls whitewashed, and the window trimmed with the calico Elira had chosen. Paxton built their beds by hand, carving a star in each headboard. Josie lined her shelf with pebbles and dried flowers. James tucked a feather beneath his pillow and called it lucky. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the last of the sun slip behind the ridge, James crawled into Elira's lap, legs too long for it now, but she held him anyway. Josie leaned against Paxton's side, her thumb tracing the stitching on his vest. "Are we staying here forever?" she asked. Paxton looked down at her. "You want to?" She nodded. "It feels like home." Elira met his eyes over the children's heads. "It is." That autumn, they planted a small orchard on the slope behind the barn, 3 apple trees and a pear. Elira watered them each morning, speaking to them soft and low, as if coaxing the roots to take hold. Paxton built a gate to keep the stock out, and the children helped scatter straw around the young trunks. At supper one night, as the wind rattled the stovepipe and the lamplight flickered across the pine walls, Paxton reached across the table and took Elira's hand. "I was thinking," he said, "about a name." She looked up, brow raised, for the place, he said. "I never gave it one before." "Didn't feel like it was much of anything but mine," she tilted her head. "And now it's a home." They named it Twin Ridge, for the children and for the slope where the orchard now grew. Winter came steady but kind. The snow fell soft and the hearth never went cold. Paxton carved toys in the evenings, a wooden horse for James, a pair of painted nesting dolls for Josie. Elira sewed new shirts from the bolts she'd purchased, her stitches even and strong. They took turns reading from the Bible in the evenings, Elira's voice growing clearer with each page. One night, with the cabin warm and the children asleep, Paxton rose from his chair and crossed to the trunk at the foot of the bed. He lifted out a small box and opened it. Inside was a ring. Plain band, gold worn soft with age, his mother's. He knelt beside her where she sat, her sewing folded in her lap. "Elira," he said, voice low, "I don't need paper or town bells, but I want to give you the name I carry if you'll take it." She touched his cheek, eyes full. "I already have." He slid the ring onto her finger, and she kissed him there on the floor, the firelight casting soft shadows across their joined hands. They married at the edge of spring. Not in town, but beneath the cottonwoods near the creek. Sheriff Lane stood beside them, the children on either side. Josie wore wildflowers in her hair, and James held the Bible. The sky stretched wide overhead, and the stream ran bright and cold at their feet. They exchanged vows spoken soft but certain, and when it was done, Paxton kissed her like he'd been waiting his whole life. She held his face in her palms and whispered, "We're home now." Years passed. The orchard bore fruit by the third summer. The children grew tall, their laughter echoing against the hills. Paxton added a second barn. Elira taught Josie to read by firelight and James to cook over an open flame. They built a life with calloused hands and unshaken faith. And every night when the stars rose and the cabin went still, Elira curled against Paxton's side, her hand resting over his heart, her breath easing into sleep. They never left Twin Ridge, they never needed to.